Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Kurz. I work for Rose Community Foundation. We are the fiscal sponsor for the Colorado Media Project, which is a collaborative of funders, and we're happy to be able to sort of be the table where funders can come together to pool resources to support the work of Colorado Media Project. And I'm really excited to hear this discussion today. The Colorado Media Project is proud to support the Voices Initiative, which spearheaded conversations between journalists and communities of color across Colorado, with the goal of taking a clear-eyed look at how stories and the information needs of Colorado communities of color are represented in the media. Our goal was to spark questions, build trust, and draw out ideas and plans of actions to take us into a future where the power of local journalism is shared by and expanded to better serve communities of color and all Coloradans. So thank you to the Colorado News Collaborative and these community leaders that you're going to hear from today for leading this incredibly important work. Our panelists are going to discuss the impacts of COVID-19 media coverage on Asian and Asian American communities, images of Asian Americans used by the media in COVID-19 stories perpetuated the narrative that Asians were to be blamed for the virus. This increased discrimination and racism targeting this racial group. Additionally, division between Asian and Black communities worsened due to the media's images of Black perpetrators attacking Asian people. So we're excited to talk today about what role and responsibility the media have to ensure that their stories don't cause harm or further misrepresent marginalized community. Joie is going to facilitate this panel. She's a member of the Asian American Pacific Islander Voices Working Group. She'll be leading this discussion and introducing our panelists. Joie's been an organizer for minority communities in Colorado for over 15 years and is the founder of CORE, which educates and equips individuals and organizations around community organizing for radical empathy. Please help me in welcoming Joie and our guests.
Thanks, everyone that is here. We have a really big audience today. It's funny, I was just talking to Annie about how when we were pitching panels, another topic that we wanted to pitch was the invisibilization of the Asian American Pacific Islander community and how that is sometimes exacerbated by media. So I'm glad it's being recorded so other folks can see it. We're really excited to be here today to talk about this really important topic. And I'm actually going to have our panelists introduce themselves, and we can definitely keep this a bit more casual. And then I'm going to have a very brief PowerPoint. Mainly, it's just images that Sarah was just talking about now to really show some examples of how this has happened. And then we have some questions that we prepared, but considering our group size, we are also open to having more of a discussion-based type of panel. That being said, I'm going to pass down my microphone to Annie.
Hi, everyone. My name is Annie VanDan. I run Asian Avenue Magazine, and today, talking about the topic, I feel it's very personal, like being someone in the community and seeing this happen to people that look like you. I think there's just a lot of trauma that we're all carrying as Asian Americans, and I also have the role, as like a local ethnic media publication. So today I will talk a little bit about kind of what we were seeing in mainstream media, but also what I felt like our role was, running this community magazine too.
Hi, my name is Gil Asakawa, and I am the oldest panelist here. I've been all over. I've bounced around the Denver media scene. I've been the Alternative Weekly Westward. I've been a music critic, feature writer, investigative reporter, help run the denverpost.com website, and have basically freelance for everybody in the area, both digital and print. And I too am very and Asian Avenue. I've written a lot. and I have a new book out called Tabemasho. Let me pimp myself here. Tabemasho, Let's Eat. It's the tasty history of Japanese food in America. And I'm kind of cranking up the hype machine even as we speak. But, the way the media covers Asians and Asian Americans in general is linked to the way the media have covered Asians during the COVID age, and it's well, we'll get into it, but it's personal for me, even though I haven't faced the direct, any verbal or physical attacks. I know lots of friends who have, and it just breaks my heart that people that I know have been treated this way over COVID, and then the media, for various reasons, none the least of it is that we don't speak out as a community, as individuals. Asians are terrible at reporting this stuff and publicizing it. We've talked to people saying, did you talk to the police? No. Do you want to talk to the media? No. So that's part of it. But, we continue to be invisible in the general community, and the media is part of it. We're part of it. And kind of the, entrenched 150 years of attitudes about Asians is also part of it. So.
I'm Tamara Chuang. I'm a business reporter at the Colorado Sun. I've actually, I moved to Denver around 2010-ish and quit my job as a reporter back in California. I was at the Orange County Register as a technology reporter. And by then the journalism industry or newspaper industry was already going downhill. So it was a good time to leave and move with my husband and my new kid. But after she started going to school, I decided I should look for a job. And what do you know? The tech reporter job at the Denver Post was open. I applied and I was working within a month there. But as you probably also know, journalism and newspapers continued to go downhill. And 4 years ago, I left, well, actually a little more than 4 years ago, left with 9 of my colleagues and started the Colorado Sun. So it's been an amazing experience. We're still kind of small, but I feel like, even what Gil has said, I feel some of the same stuff just from my life, growing up as an Asian American, and happy to be here to talk about it.
So I'm Vignesh Ramachandran. I'm a full-time freelancer for the last couple of years during the pandemic. I grew up here in Colorado, went to CU Boulder. Actually, Gil's brother, Glenn, was the first Asian American journalist I ever met when I was 12 years old. I interviewed him for the Colorado Kids section in the Denver Post. And and it was cool. It was whoa, Asians can be journalists too. So anyways, in the last few years, I worked in local media in the Bay Area and then was at ProPublica in Chicago. And then during the pandemic, kind of brought me back to Colorado and decided to stay here. So I've been a full-time freelancer. Last year, mostly worked with the PBS NewsHour. And this year, I'm with the Washington Post.
Thanks for all those wonderful introductions. Really exciting to have this esteemed panel of journalists, media folks here. We're just going to show some slides and pictures to put a little context about what we're talking about today. And I think it comes to no surprise for folks, or folks might be familiar with, that there has been an astronomical increase in anti-Asian hate crimes for the past few years. A lot of this is attributed to COVID-19 and the fear and dislike of Asian people. And so today we're specifically wanting to talk about how the media played a role in this. So this slide is just some information from a recent study that 1 in 5 Asian American and Pacific Islanders have experienced a hate incident in the past 2 years. So 1 in 5 is a really big number. And nearly half of those respondents reported feeling depression and anxiety. So it is a very relevant and real topic right now. And it's really important that we know when we start talking about the media's role in this, we talk about how media has been reporting COVID-19. And here are just some examples of how it's been reported, especially in the beginning. When we first started seeing cases in the United States, there was not a lot of information around the demographics of these people, but photos of like Chinatown, of Flushing, of Asian folks would be used. So you see right here, it says coronavirus in New York, Manhattan woman is first confirmed case in state. And you'll see the subtext, it says a woman had traveled in Iran, contracted the virus, and is now isolated at home. But for this story, they actually used a picture of Flushing, New York. So it's completely irrelevant to the actual story itself. It's not like she was from this area, or if not, like she contracted it from this area. And you have the same sort of picture from the New York Post. The first case of coronavirus confirmed in Manhattan. And then you see again from the Hill, this is the second case of coronavirus. And I think it's important to note that a lot of folks in the Asian American Pacific Islander community coming from Asian countries, it is common to wear a mask. And this is probably part of the reason why the media wanted to use these photos, because it shows what they believe a pandemic can look like. And beyond just that, the Asian American Journalists Association actually made a statement and said that the usage of photos that are not directly related to coronavirus during coverage of the disease is not only poor reporting and decision making, it also further stokes unnecessary and unfounded fears about COVID-19 and negatively affects the safety and well-being of members of the Asian American community. So some of these publications did actually change the photos for some of them, but the fact of the matter is nothing really dies on the internet, right? You can still see those photos. And then one more point that we did want to make note of is during the rise in the anti-Asian hate crimes, the media often reported the perpetrators who were Black or African American. Sometimes this is because that only surveillance footages are from lower income areas and therefore more BIPOC representation in those areas. Sometimes because they are more sensationalist stories. And as a result, there have been increased tensions between our communities. However, studies have shown that the majority of perpetrators are normally male and white in upwards of 75% of news stories. So it's important to note how these stories are being told to our communities and how it affects how we relate to each other. So this was really meant to give a brief overview and context of the situation that we see ourselves in. And now we're going to open it up to the panelists to talk more about how they see this happening within our local context, how they have experienced it personally. And so the first question is, during a lot of the COVID-19 coverage, how did you see the coverage in regards to Asian Americans, and how might it have changed throughout the pandemic? And anyone can start.
I'll start. Sorry. I'll start. I think the media have backed off some on this obsession of showing Asians as the face of COVID, partly because of our former president is no longer in office. And I think he stoked a lot of that with his racist inferences, and even down to calling, on national television, Kung Flu. That opens the door to a lot of people to start believing that this is an Asian, disease. But I think, and the media did a good job of being in opposition to a lot of that, but not all media. And unfortunately, I think the believers of said former president, twice impeached, don't really pay attention to maybe mainstream media that would call out some of the falsehoods, and so I totally I think the stories that I've heard of Asians even here in Denver being abused verbally, I bet those people believe that former president. So so there are media that fell in line, and media that I think were more balanced, and but it was disturbing to me, especially that first year, to see pictures even here in Denver of, respected news sources that I respect, that I go to. And whenever I read a story about COVID, they would pull a file photo from South Federal, or an Asian, like an AP file photo or a Getty file photo. But to see images of, a couple months before, they ran a story about a restaurant on South Federal that was, still running in spite of COVID, and it's a family-run thing. And, a couple months later, I see a story about COVID, and it's using that a photo from that story. And I think that was just lazy journalism. And just going to a file photo and typing in a couple of keywords, that doesn't cut it. You have to make some editorial decisions about the relationships that you're setting up between, elements in a story package.
So when COVID first started, so March 2020, the community was already feeling these impacts. Locally, the Asian Chamber of Commerce had kind of gone out to that community. Federal talked to a lot of Asian businesses, and there was like a substantial decrease in customers. And even in the Chinese community, I remember even my mom was like, let's not go to the Chinese restaurants. And kind of what Joie's saying, there was just so much confusion in the beginning, where was it coming from? And there was harassment that was happening online. We saw someone, just like a fake Facebook profile, writing reviews on Asian businesses here. Yeah, he was posting a picture of a bat, oh, I had this bat here at this Chinese restaurant and now I have COVID. Just further spreading the fear. And yeah, because we started documenting some of the things that were happening locally. And so the community already felt that, but it seemed like the mainstream media still wasn't quite reporting on it yet. There was a lot of, concerns that it felt like it wasn't until later a lot of celebrities started talking about it and bringing awareness. I guess people who had more funding in the Asian community started pulling funds together and starting these foundations and groups. And so really raising more awareness, using their platforms to talk about what was happening. The other part was it wasn't until it was very violent. And so I guess it felt like, what did it take for Asians to be seen? People dying and the fatalities was when the mainstream media started really covering it more. The big thing in the community then was the Atlanta shooting that happened a year into the pandemic, the March 2021. And so at that time, I think it was just this huge wake up call. There was a lot of kind of real pain and fear in the community. Prior to that, I think there would be different levels of some people feeling like, oh, this is just how it is. And kind of the older generations of the Asian community would say, this is just the price to pay as immigrants here. This is the same discrimination we felt. And kind of what Gil said, how we've always been represented. And then it was the Atlanta shooting. Suddenly we were like, okay, we are being targeted in these, this mass shooting. And I think what was hard was even locally, we came together, we held space, there was a lot of mourning and grieving in our community. And then the Boulder grocery store shooting was the week after. And so it was hard too, because that was local too, of just all this pain happening in the community. And then in the Asian community also feeling oh, we kind of had this moment almost, in this kind of negative and sad way, but just there was some momentum to really build awareness. And then it was already shifting so quickly, the media was already moving on to the next thing. So I do remember in the beginning, there was a lot of fear among Asians of coughing. There was just oh, if we even go anywhere, we can't cough, or people are just looking at you. And that was kind of those subtle microaggressions and racism that then became much more to the actual verbal insults. And a lot of what we were seeing and hearing in Colorado was mostly verbal and spitting, you brought the virus here, or go back to your country. And it was happening towards all Asians, right? And so it wasn't just Chinese people, because if you looked this way, they didn't care what you were. I remember talking to like a Korean adoptee, and she was like, I have like no connection to China, but like she got spat on, and so I remember having a conversation with like a South Asian person and just saying like, it's almost like dividing the community, the Asian community, being like, oh, well, I'm not Chinese. Or if they hear something like, I'm not, like, it's not me. And they were saying, that's how their community felt like after 9/11, and how the media was kind of showing images of Muslim and, kind of South Asian people. And so in some ways they felt a little disconnected, because now this is happening towards kind of East Asians. But it was kind of like a wake up call for me too. Like, oh yeah, that happened to like another community so close to us. And what did we do then to support them? So.
Well, I could say probably from my experience, we're sort of a mainstream publication at the Colorado Sun, but to me, it always felt more internal, and maybe that's just because how I grew up. My parents were immigrants, but I was born in San Diego, in a pretty white community, and I've always felt like an outsider. I mean, I think I still do, even in my newsroom, and we have a few more Asians than me, so that was like nice. But I think throughout this whole period, to me, it was a more national thing that was happening. I mean, it was disappointing, but I know the local journalists were just scrambling to cover, the basics of COVID and the health concerns. And then when all these other topics came up, it was more of a, how does it affect me personally? And I don't know if a lot of newsrooms had that time to sit back and be reflective on how they were covering their community, because, when seeing some of the headlines and stuff, and of course the name calling that went about, to me, it was cringeworthy and disappointing. But I did feel like, even with my colleagues, we would talk about it, but more from not necessarily how we were covering things, but more from, why is this happening? Why are these headlines out there? Why are these photos out there? And, I think there's a growing awareness within some of the mainstream newsrooms, by more than just the minority reporters, on how to cover these communities. I mean, at least I feel that way, compared to what it was like 10 or 20 years ago. I don't know if you guys feel the same, but I still feel like, wow, I could have done more, and now that I've had time to think about it, it's probably a conversation that just can't stop. And I mean, I know there were some things that Gil said about feeling like a prop and stuff, and I struggle with that all the time. But I also feel like if I'm not the prop, someone's got to say it, and if I don't, who will? I don't know if anyone else will, so.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I thought was really interesting, especially in like early 2021, was you saw in all the media reports the common lines from Stop AAPI Hate, citing those statistics. And I thought a lot about like the power of data in really bringing awareness to, hey, this is happening at scale. There were, of course, the headlines around that horrific murder in San Francisco of that elderly gentleman, and there were all those high profile cases, the stabbings in that Texas parking lot of a Sam's Club. And I thought it was really interesting as Stop AAPI Hate kept putting out reports and really showing, I think, the scale of how this was happening. It just really attracted more and more media reports and more attention to kind of, hey, this has been happening during the pandemic, but it's also been a long-standing issue in this country. Maybe it opened up some of those conversations. So I felt as like a freelancer, or as kind of when I was embedded at the PBS NewsHour, to be able to kind of pitch to editors or producers like, hey, like, this is we want to cover the impact on small businesses or the impact of how this affected these families, and here's how it's affecting people all around the country. Like, it made that case a little bit more powerful and easier with the data that was put out there. So I don't know, I'm always thinking about kind of the data behind some of these stories.
A data geek. Well, you know, stopaaphate.org, I think that's a really important project. It came about because of an activist and a professor in the Bay Area started kind of compiling the data, and then they invited people to submit stories and experiences and attacks that happened. What level of attack was it? And you could be anonymous. And I think that really helped them gather data. And it's after the Atlanta attacks that Stop API Hate became this kind of really well-known source for journalists all over the country. And that's when I started seeing Stop API Hate being cited over and over again. And it's powerful to have a source that journalists can rely on that talks about these things. And I remember they put out their first 1 year report of I forget how many it was, but it was a ridiculously high number of anti-Asian attacks from 2020 to 2021. That report came out the same week, just before the Atlanta attacks. And it's like this flashing red light went off. And I think it's great that they're still doing it. And I think it would be great for media to check in on them once in a while. And don't just let this kind of, we've checked it off, we've used them, we can't cite them again. And this stuff, if you follow the Asian and Asian American media, a couple of websites, people like Asian Avenue, this stuff's still going on. The attacks against Asians still going on. It's just kind of receded into the kind of the mist of yesterday's news and where's the shiny new object kind of thing. And I think it would be great to keep Stop AAPI Hate alive and bring people's attention back to it once in a while.
Yeah, thanks for all of those wonderful answers. I feel like a lot of the answers actually touch on most of the prepared questions. So thank you for answering such in-depth responses. Again, like I mentioned, we touched a bit on this already, but would love to hear a bit more. With the coverage of COVID-19 and the way that it was for Asian Americans, and also the coverage of the anti-Asian hate, how do you think this has affected the Asian American community, seeing these headlines all the time? And how has it affected you personally, maybe in the newsroom?
We probably stopped reading them. And mainstream news. I mean, it's... my family, my immediate family lives in San Francisco and San Diego, and I mean, my brother, he lives. His wife grew up in Chinatown in San Francisco, and we went to visit them this summer, and they've moved to near the Golden Gate Park, and I didn't even realize this, but a huge part of that community is I think mostly Chinese, even not even like other ethnicities. Right? It's immigrants. There's like dim sum on every corner, which is so nice. I mean, and this is more of a suburban neighborhood. So I mean, I feel like it's definitely become divisive because certain communities are becoming more insular, and maybe less open to mainstream media and coverage. And, I have to admit, I feel like in the Denver area, I live here in the area. When I first moved here about 10 years ago, I was so excited that there was a Malaysian restaurant, because that's where my mom's from. And I mean, there was there was a dim sum restaurant, and it was like, oh, at least we get one of each, and because I'm from Southern California as well, but it's just such a small community here, and I just don't think the community knows one another, and that's why it's extra hard for even the outside the mainstream media to really keep those relationships going, but again, I mean, that's a terrible excuse, because it's like, the local media probably just doesn't do enough to make those meetings happen all the time and those relationships happen all the time. And we have to be reminded of it. But I think that's probably been one of the impacts. And I feel like, the way I was raised, growing up in a mostly white community, that I've never wanted to be that token. So I didn't necessarily pitch those stories. But I feel like, having more Asian Americans or, Asians in the newsrooms, you relate more to a community, so you know where to go, you know who to talk to, you know what questions to ask that don't sound that dumb. And that's why we've always needed that. I mean, I've always felt like that my whole career, but it's been a struggle in journalism, as you know, and I think it almost like all of that went up in the air when the industry started imploding. So I don't know, no good answers here. I'm just sharing my own experience, but
first talk about the community and then from like a media perspective, but there is still a lot of fear and trauma in the community. My mom runs a Chinese senior daycare center, and so a lot of Chinese seniors live downtown in these kind of apartment buildings together, and so it was going out on your own. For a long time, they would go to the grocery store and just buy a lot of frozen food, kind of however long you can kind of stay at home and not go out. We tried locally to do some of the things we were seeing in San Francisco and the bigger cities. They were doing a lot of kind of community watch and walk with seniors, and it was just so hard because the community here is so small to figure out volunteers and get that set up, and language barriers. We'd have volunteers that didn't speak Chinese and it just didn't really work. And so the community, the seniors here just were kind of more and more isolated. And still holding some kind of healing circle spaces, and so even now they're just open to Asians to join, and so they're different every time. Sometimes they're very kind of pragmatic, these are the things we need to do, and what can we do that's more productive to make change. And then sometimes people come on and they're still just crying on these Zoom kind of spaces. And so the community is, as a whole, we're all going through this COVID recovery period, but I think for Asians there's this additional kind of burden that we're carrying of this potential racism we might face anytime we kind of walk out the door. And so that's definitely affected mental health, and everyone's talking about self-care, and the community again feeling that at a even heavier level. We've seen a lot more Asian Americans seeking mental health and therapy care, and so as community organizations, we've been just trying to provide more resources. So developed a kind of list of Asian mental health therapists, because we were also hearing was once they were trying to seek care, they couldn't find any providers that could relate to what they were experiencing, and then just a lot of the cultural aspects as Asians and Asian Americans. For the magazine, I remember just struggling with figuring out how to cover this. In the beginning, I was trying to be very positive. And so one of the first things that happened was Governor Polis actually went out and visited the Asian businesses. And so again, this was March 2020. And so I just did this lovely piece, the governor is coming to see the Asians and support the businesses. And I just kind of made it much smaller that this hate was going on, And then over time, I was like, oh, this is very serious, and like, this is the platform where I need to kind of elevate what was happening. So then it kind of went full on the other way, and it was like so emotional for me because I was just covering all of these things. And then the Atlanta shooting, and then a year after the Atlanta shooting, so this March, I did kind of like an update on where we've been, and I kind of told myself, like, okay, I've covered this so much, and Tamara joke about like not wanting to read it anymore. I definitely felt that because we hosted like a panel just talking about where we've been for the year, and it just was so emotional. And there was just this kind of huge weight that you're carrying because it felt so personal. Like, I was like, I'm not just covering this, I'm like feeling all of this, and so I kind of told myself it was time to celebrate Asian joy, like really focus on the other part of the story of kind of what Asians are doing that are kind of positive and coming out of COVID and doing that instead of always talking about these incidents. So yeah, I went through a phase. I put in a lot of those kind of high profile ones, like the pictures. There was a lot of illustrations of the people that had died, and I just remember putting those in and just telling myself, like, okay, like, I did what I could, and like, I needed to take care of myself too, So coming out of that, like, 1 year of the Atlanta shooting, I just was like, I'm gonna like take a break from covering this so much. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think to Gil's point about, something I've thought about a lot is, following up 1 year later after Atlanta, or, checking back in with Stop AAPI Hate on, what's the latest. I mean, I think like that's one thing that I think is frustrating just as an Asian American, but then also as a journalist, that it's kind of like we're always, the main agenda is always chasing after the shiny object. I mean, I'll be honest, I think in the last week, looking at the intense coverage of the Queen, and to be honest, I mean, I think about Asian Americans are the fastest growing racial or ethnic demographic in this country. We're part of the fabric of this country, and to kind of see the disparate coverage is like super frustrating. And I don't know, I hope we can change that. But I mean, it's interesting with like the Queen coverage in the last week. I mean, there's been a handful of stories that kind of have explained like the colonial impact on communities of color and things like that. So there's like hope there, but I mean, I want to understand what's happening to the Asian American business we heard about last year that was vandalized. Like, what happened a year later? Are they still in business? Like, I don't know. I think there's just so many stories that have been left untold.
I have a question. Can we ask questions from the audience?
Yeah.
No, we have too big of an audience. Sorry. You have to step to the microphone.
I mean, I guess one of the questions is, we've talked a little bit about the relationship between like ethnic media or people who are not white that are in all white newsrooms, and there is a burden there, that is unfair, and but like I'm also wondering, like, are there opportunities that you're seeing or starting to see to bring stories, like bring up things like you just said, having more, especially on the local stage, what are opportunities to get more of those really important stories that you hear, Annie, when you're doing your reporting into the mainstream media? Do you see opportunities to work with your peers, I guess, on a peer-to-peer basis?
I was just going to say, because of, the makeup of a newsroom, everyone has their own interests. And I think that's always been the case. I don't know if that can always change. I mean, I'm just thinking about who from the Colorado Sun is at this conference. It's me and Tatiana, who's Black. So, even though there's a move to care, and I mean, just awareness, there is awareness in newsrooms. I do feel like that has changed in 20 years, but I mean, we're the ones who always get asked to go speak on panels and to go to these conferences and who may cover these stories. I'm not, maybe it's just, and I mentioned this earlier, the makeup of the newsroom. I've always been, actually one of my early journalism experiences kind of after some internships and out of college was hearing about the Asian American Journalism Association. And this is back in the 90s. I didn't even know about it. I went to the conference and I was on like their student weekly newspaper. And from there, I was just exposed to this amazing group of people, right? A lot of my friends from back then have since dropped out of journalism. I'm not even sure how many of my mentors are still in journalism. So it's like this, what I was saying earlier in that it feels like when the industry sort of tanked, so did any concern on diversifying newsrooms coverage and being aware. So, I mean, I think there's an awareness, but, everyone has their own interests. So
I think that there is definitely an awareness, since the, 3 years ago, Black Lives Matter, things have changed in our society in general. And I think in the news media as well, there's a much more awareness of, oh man, we're looking at this from a white privilege perspective. A lot of these terms which were brand new or not in people's heads, 5 years ago, certainly 10 years ago, are now commonly used, and people understand what they mean and what the implications are. And I think news media know that too, but yeah, when you don't have the resources, who are you going to send out to cover what? And so that's always been, I think, holding back coverage. At the same time, I was able to contact, the Colorado Sun a year and a half ago about this young man in Denver who is competing at the Special Olympics. And, they said, yeah, let's do this story. And it was great. And they hired a photographer from the Springs that I knew from when I worked at the Gazette down there, who's an awesome photographer. The photos were great. And I don't know that story would have been accepted if I pitched it 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. I think now's the time with mainstream media to say, hey, this is a good story. You should be paying attention to it. And I regularly send off emails to my friends at Denverite, at the Colorado Sun, at the Denver Post, Boulder Daily Camera, when I see interesting stories about communities of color. And this is really the opportunities there because there's an openness to it. It really does come down to, the resources of how's a newsroom going to cover something.
And I would echo that sentiment because newsrooms are smaller, and the more we hear from the community, I mean, it's up to the community as well to make sure those stories get written. And, I'm pretty sure every news organization, especially in the Denver area, has all the reporters listed on their site and all their emails. So, we may not be getting to every story out there, but, that's what the community's for too, right? To tell us what's happening. So
I think that's why the Colorado Media Project's Voices, initiative is super important because, reaching out to communities of color, and now that you're doing Pacific Islanders, South Asians, and Native people. I think that's so important to get people comfortable with the idea of speaking to the media and reaching out and, hey, you guys aren't telling our stories. Here's some that you might be interested in. And it is true. There's some responsibility for the communities to get information in a way that's, digestible to the media. I've done media training where I show really, really bad examples of press releases. and really good examples of press releases and how you can help yourself by helping the media do their job. And so there's a lot of that training, and I think that communities of color and Asian communities in particular can benefit from, because culturally Asians are not about promoting ourselves. We just, it's this thing where you don't trumpet yourself or your community or your family or your accomplishments, and that's one reason why we're invisible. So.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. I think from the community end, it's really important to build genuine relationships with folks. I think there is this systematic distrust of the media, who has at times been exploitive, right? Going into the community, getting like these personal stories and never visiting them again. So I think there's a lot to be said about building genuine connections, like getting to know folks outside of a pursuit of a story. And yeah, it's more work, but it's important that this trust is built, because once that bridge is built, then people are more likely to come to you, be like, hey, I have like this new restaurant, or like I have a new dish at my restaurant, would you want to cover it, right? I think that's really huge. I do want to shift gears a little bit, because we did have like a whole second portion of our panel that was supposed to be about this topic, so I wanted to give some space for it. And so we talked about briefly at the beginning about how the coverage of the rise in anti-Asian hate often would show and sensationalize perpetrators that were of color, mainly Black and African American, and how this had a negative impact on relationships between the Black and Asian communities. I'd love to sort of hear your thoughts on this. How have you seen this, and maybe how things can be improved in this aspect?
Can I start with some context? Because there's been tension between African American communities and Asian American communities for decades, and usually, there's just racism in general aimed at both communities. But usually, you can point back to a February 1966 article in the New York Times Magazine by William Peterson, a sociologist, a respected sociologist, who wrote about how wonderful the Japanese American community is doing in early 1966. Keep that timeline in mind. Because, we treated them so badly 25 years ago. We put them in, prison camps during World War II, and now their kids are going to college. They have some of the highest graduation rates. They have the highest employment rates. They're getting good jobs. And he did not use the term in this first article. He did not use the term model minority, but that concept has been tagged as a model minority myth, because a subtext of that article from the New York Times Magazine was, look at how great these Japanese Americans are doing despite what happened to them. Why can't the the term was Negro. Why can't the Negro, community be this way? This is at the time when, the civil rights movement was front and center. And it's just having this article compare, even in a very slight and subtle way, comparing Asians to African Americans, I think set up this dynamic that made it really easy for the early 90s. Rodney King, the riots that happened after Rodney King, and African Americans and Koreans in Los Angeles, and then also in the early 90s, the anti-Asian riots between African Americans and Koreans, business owners in New York City. And there's a great movie out there called Gook. That was made in, I think it came out in 1994, 1996, but it was by a director named Justin Chon. And it's about two Korean-American brothers who run a store in a black part of LA, and they strike up a friendship with a African-American young woman. And, during the riots, there's a lot of drama and tragedy. It's a great movie, and it really is a snapshot of how Asians and African Americans related. to each other. And I think that still exists in an unspoken way. And that's the context that I think it becomes easy for the media to focus on it, because they are kind of, the photos are there, or the video cameras captured this or that. But it is true that, it's not just African Americans that are attacking Asians, but a lot of the images that we see are. So that's the historical context, and I just wanted to get that out there. If you want to talk about what's going on.
Sure. Yes, that's helpful, Gil. I was going to talk on some of that, so I won't even go there now. No. So one of the issues too with the kind of division between Black and Asian communities is, the view on policing, for example. With more of these attacks, the Asian community, for their safety, want more policing, and with everything that's been happening after George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, there was like a movement for, defunding the police. And so those kind of basic views, even in our own communities, we were approaching it differently and kind of further dividing our communities that, locally here, Asians and kind of Black and African immigrant populations we know are in Aurora together and, work, live in shared spaces. And so locally, we did do some work with the Asian Pacific Development Center and like the local NAACP around trying to address this and the importance of Asian and Black solidarity movements. And so these are happening across the nation, and even here, locally in Aurora, trying to make more effort to, show up for each other at each other's events and, hosting events together to be in these spaces where we know we have more, in common than we have differences. For the magazine, around the time of, George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, there were these kind of campaigns like Asians for Black Lives. And so I remember I just went and I bought all these shirts, and we were giving them away to just some of our readers, and then kind of getting quotes from them, like, why do you think this is important? And I was just trying to kind of put that in the magazine for awareness. And so I wasn't sure like what kind of feedback we would get and if there would be pushback. There were some, anonymous letters sent to the magazine, like, why would you post this? Like, don't you know, like, Black people hate Asian people and you're so clueless and things like that. But there was only like maybe 2 of those. And so I felt like, okay, people are wanting to kind of speak up, and Asians are also knowing that we need to show up for other communities. One of the biggest issues the Black community has with the Asian community is because we don't say anything. Right. And there is the perception that, we benefit from all the work that like the Black community is doing through civil rights movement, or kind of being the voice that then kind of trickles down to other minority groups, and that then Asian Americans don't ever kind of show up for these important causes. And so just trying to educate within our own community, and then doing the work with the Black community too, to say like, look, a lot of people in our community are immigrants and, refugees too. There's a language barrier. There's just a lot of challenges for our community to, voice, be a voice. And, we already experienced that already, like culturally, that's just kind of a challenge for us already. And so just trying to raise education to build bridges between the communities rather than kind of like further exacerbate this divide. And so when we did do our panel for the 1-year anniversary of the Atlanta shooting, we had like a Black leader in the community, so Maisha Fields, who had also experienced, gun violence in her own family. She came and like spoke on the panel. And so just trying to make sure we're kind of creating spaces for each other to show up for each other. So
I want to actually shout out Joie, because Joey's been involved in a lot of efforts to bridge the gap and to bring together the Asian communities and the African American communities. And CORE, the kind of the consulting organization that she helped start with some other women, one of the first big things you did was kind of a unity effort, right? And so there are efforts out there. There are Asians who are building bridges and relationships, and yet, we have decades of this tension, and so it's. I hope that it'll get better in the long run. I don't know what else to say about that, but thank you for doing what you do.
Thanks, Gil. I see you, Ellen. Okay. yeah, I think that it's important that, yes, there's decades of like tension, but there's also decades of really great collaborative and cooperative work that we've done together that we don't hear about because the media doesn't focus that much on it, right? They like to sensationalize the drama, the conflict. But you know, I think of like Yuri Kochiyama and Malcolm X and Grace Lee Boggs and like all these people who have been fighting together for a really long time, and we just don't hear about it as much, right? Our partnership has truly been linked for a long time. Our liberations are really linked. We don't have a ton of time left. We have around 6 minutes. But I did see some hands raised. We can maybe do 1 or 2 more questions. I'm sorry, I don't know whose hands went up first. Does anyone have an idea? Or okay, let's go for Ellen, and then we can come over to you. If that's okay.
First, I want to say thank you to those that are our allies, because what I have found is that we do need allies for our voices, not only historically, but also going forward. But what I don't know how much this was publicized, but after the Boulder shooting, a person from the Muslim community said she was inundated from calls from the media saying, what do you think about him? What do you know about him? And she flatly had to say, we don't know him. So there's still that stereotype happening.
Yeah.
And plus, the allyship, from what I have experienced, is that there are people that play like they're our allies, but they're not our allies. And they will turn on us. And I even had to ask a friend of mine who is a black male, why do you hate Asians? And he said, because a lot of it is the social media. He said they're posting all this, and I said, I have to put him straight, and I said, no, don't believe it. You know, and it's like, it's the misinformation, it's the disinformation, it's that we need to get not only our voices out there and representation, but every day it's just another thing, you know. And I've told some of you my stories, the last 3 years really have been amplified because I grew up with racism. I'm the child of immigrants from China, and even as an elementary school child, you know, there were the taunts and the bullying and in the workplace, and you know, it's just lifelong and it's generational for me, because my legacy goes back to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which is 140 years ago. So, you know, and it hurts me that the community is still hurting, and even with recent incidents, you know, there's that little blurb of something happening, but okay, let's do more. You know, let's get our voices out, and let's get the support and the allyship. And I think the media is a really good resource, you know, to break down the misinformation, disinformation, and the lies.
Thanks, Ellen.
I just want to
yeah.
add a little something to that, to what you said. Thank you for making that comment. I think it's really important that there isn't an overgeneralization. I have an Asian friend who made a comment to me, why do black people hate Asians? And I'm like, black people don't hate Asians. It's not all black people. It's not all Asian people. We need to understand that generalization of communities is not helpful, and it's not reality. And the other thing I wanted to bring up was that I think class is also playing a part in this, and no one is talking about class.
That's true.
So that also must be discussed.
Yeah, thank you for your comments. Does anyone want to respond to any of that? We have like a minute or so left. No responses other than yes, we agree, and those are great comments.
Very important comments. Thank you.
I think in that case, then we're going to go for maybe a really quick closing. What is one thing that you would ask of media to do better in coverage of our communities. And we have around like a minute or so left, so maybe like 1 or 2 sentences per person.
I think the media should not parachute into Asian American communities and see these stories as everyday stories in politics, economics, culture. You know, every single story affects us. So stop parachuting in. Let's tell these stories authentically every day.
My comment might be similar, but I feel like it is hard to not do that, but having that awareness helps. I feel like media needs to interact more with the community. It doesn't always have to be a story. You know, I mean, how can we only go in and write the story? I mean, we've got to know what's happening. We can't, you know, and like I cover the economy. I don't write every single economy story, but I listen and read to, you know, all that news. So anyway, that's mine.
Mine is kind of a long-term hope, and this is something I've been yelling about for years now. The media in general needs to hire, media is plural, need to hire more Asians. And yeah, they need to hire everybody of color, but there need to be more Asians in the newsroom. But that's not it. That's just checking off a box. That's just meeting some quotas. No, then you have to nurture their careers and get them into middle management positions, editor positions, because that's when they'll make a difference, and that's when they'll start to assign stories, decide what's going to go on A1 or on the front, homepage. That's when they'll hire and fire, and that's when change will really come and reflect the community at large more than just, the power structure within the media company deciding what's important for the readers.
I think just all three of you just shared different parts of what I was thinking too, but to really listen to the community and, show up at the events, build relationships with the community leaders and kind of look to the community for where the stories are. I had someone say there was a media group, with the hate incidents that were happening, and there was a lot of people wanting to cover it, and they'd always ask, like, do you know someone that experienced something? And I remember making a connection and then later asking that person, well, how did the interview go? And they were like, well, because it was just only like a verbal insult, they didn't want to like run my story. They really wanted something that was like more violent or a physical attack. And so it just felt like the media kind of went in there with a story in mind already, wanting to depict in this more sensational way, like verbal insult was not enough. And so just really telling the media, like, you kind of have to really know what's happening in the community and kind of listen to the community for where those stories are.
Thanks, everyone on the panel. If we could give a round of applause for taking the time to be here. I'm going to hand it over to Sarah to close us out.
Thanks, everyone on the panel. I just want to acknowledge there's a lot of pain and trauma in this conversation, and just express deep gratitude for you all to come and share those stories and those reflections. And to those in the room, thank you for being here. I'm really glad we've recorded this session so that we can amplify this conversation in other ways moving forward. And the next sessions have begun, so please make your way to those, but really just thank you all for being in this conversation.